Welcome to the Asia Climate Capital Podcast, a series dedicated to tackling the business and finance of the energy transition and decarbonization in Asia, with the capital markets in mind. Welcome to the episode 8 of the Asia Climate Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Jacobelli, and we're recording on the 23rd of May, 2022. Today's guest is Fabian D'Avola, who is a true Asia renewable energy veteran. I don't mean that in terms of age, but I mean that in terms of experience, of course. Fabian is a senior director and head of the Asia Pacific region at Glennmont Partners. And as always, please note that all opinions expressed are the guest's own opinion, do not express the views or opinions of previous or current employers. So in this podcast, we are going to look into, in some depth, look into some of the hurdles for private equity investments when it comes to investing in Asia Pacific region, in the Asia Pacific region, or at least I should we're going to look at a few selected countries, because talking about over 30 countries would take a few hours in the region, including, for example, Australia, Japan, among others. And as usual, we'll get to learn a little bit more about our guest first, then we'll discuss the topic, and finally we'll try to do a bit of crystal gazing, trying to take a long-term look at the topic from a business and finance perspective. So first of all, allow me to welcome you, Fabian, to the Asia Climate Capital Podcast. Very grateful you could carve out some time to share your insights.
Thank you, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Fabian, could we start today's conversation with you explaining a little bit about how you became involved in the Asia energy transition? And we've known each other for a couple of decades, so and I know some of the history, but I think it'd be great for you to share kind of your journey to the energy transition and decarbonization.
Sure. My background is in engineering, and I was always interested in technology, mainly in cars and energy-related technology. My first job was in engineering with the Ford Motor Company in the late 90s. And that's when I started to become more interested in things like hybrid vehicles and alternative sources of energy. But it was too early, oil was cheap, and climate change was not a pressing issue. Then I went to New York to do my MBA at NYU, and after the MBA, I started to work for Merrill Lynch in London in a group that was focusing on energy infrastructure and real estate. And it was there when I really understood the magnitude of the climate change issue and the massive energy transition that was required. So I decided to specialize in sustainable energy. So then I attended the Sustainable Energy Futures program at Imperial College in London, where I learned about all these technologies in more depth. And that's also when I realized that the key to fighting climate change was going to be China and Asia. So I became very interested in understanding how real and how sustainable was the economic transformation in China and in other Asian countries. I was really fascinated with what I found. So I started to learn a lot more about China. We hired a Chinese nanny in our home in London to speak Chinese to our kids. I traveled to China to learn more. And then when both my wife and I had an opportunity to move to China, we decided to move straight away to Shanghai. And since then, that's when I started to work in renewable energy in Asia. And at the time, it was a small market, but it was the right time in 2010. And since then, I had a chance to work in different countries in Asia, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing background, especially those countries are so incredibly different. If we look at the direction they're taking, I mean they're all decarbonizing, obviously, but at different paces and at different levels. Fabian, if I can follow up on this, what about your current involvement in the energy transition and decarbonization? Could you perhaps explain a little bit about Glennmont Partners? I mean, I think most people will know that it's a major, or should know that it's a major private equity investment entity. But also perhaps you could touch as to what Glennmont is doing in Asia, including its strategy in the region.
Yes, I have been with Glennmont for 1 year now, and I have been hired to develop the business in Asia. I'm based in Singapore. Glennmont started in London 14 years ago as a clean energy infrastructure asset manager. At the time, it was a part of BNP Paribas, but later became owned by the four partners: Joost Bergsma, Peter Dixon, Scott Lawrence, and Francesco Cacciabue. The first equity fund closed in 2009 at 437 million euros. And this fund has now been fully invested and divested. The second fund closed in 2013 at 500 million euros. It followed a similar strategy than the first fund and has also now been fully invested and divested. The third equity fund closed in 2018 at 850 million euros and also follow a similar strategy than the other two funds. And it's now in the process of getting fully invested. We also have a credit fund that invests in project finance loans in the secondary market. That is 200 million euros and has also been fully invested. And now Glennmont has reached first close of the first global equity fund.
And then so for Asia, you decided to place your headquarters in Singapore, right?
Yes, in Asia we're going to have a very small team in Singapore. That is the headquarters. Is the team that's going to be supporting the other countries. But in those countries where we operate, we need to have people, and we will have 2 or 3 people in each of those countries, and the team in Singapore will be supporting them. But yeah, that's pretty much the way. But we try to decentralize. Even before COVID, I think that you had to have a decentralized strategy in Asia, probably more than in Europe. But COVID, even if there was any doubt, COVID then confirmed that, right? So
yes.
If you cannot travel is a big problem. And also you want to have people close to your developers, to your stakeholders, people that speak the same language, have the same culture. So for us, having a small team in Singapore and then decentralized resources is the best option.
Obviously, I mean, you really need the local people with the local knowledge because of the intricacies of the individual markets. But Glennmont, just to follow up on the strategy before we move on to the second part of the discussion, Glennmont, I think, I believe, if I remember correctly, launched an IPP, independent power producer, for solar projects in Southern Europe called BNZ. In September last year, targeting about 1 gigawatt of solar projects in Italy, Portugal, and Spain by 2024. Is there any kind of similar plans potentially in the long term for Asia? Is that one of the potential strategies that you may be pursuing?
Yes, absolutely. BNZ stands for Beyond Net Zero. And so far has been a very successful development platform that Glennmont implemented in Europe. And this is 100% owned by Glennmont. So the idea is to follow a similar strategy in Asia. However, the market in Asia is more fragmented, with development being very local, and different countries having, their own currencies, their development frameworks, banks, etc. So it might make more sense for us to do a development platform in 1 or 2 countries rather than one development platform across countries in Asia. So we are now working on one in South Korea, and we have been looking at one in Taiwan as well. So the concept is the same, but the difference is that it might be more focused on a country-by-country basis. Right. And the idea is to bundle a number of projects under one development platform Projects can be early stage, ready to build or COD. The platform will have a team that will centralize EPC contracts, PPA contracts. I have more options at the financing level. You can finance at the SPV level or at the holdco level. And by doing that, you can achieve economies of scale and a lower LCOE. Once the majority of the projects reach COD, then we can sell the full platform with the team a few years down the road. So that's basically a strategy.
That's great. No, thank you for sharing that. So now we move on to the second part of the discussion, where I'm gonna kind of pick your brain, so to speak, try to get your insights on what you think are the current key hurdles impacting private equity investments in the region. And obviously we can't talk about, as I mentioned earlier, 30 or 40 countries in jurisdictions, because that will take a few hours. But perhaps you could narrow it down to a few issues and a few countries that you see are key.
When it comes to solar and onshore wind, I think it's no secret that land is an issue for several countries in Asia due to their high population densities, their hilly topographies. The best examples are probably Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. In these countries, it's going to be essential to have dual usage of land. For example, agri-PV, the use of the original land and solar on top, right? For example, we have seen some agri-solar projects in Japan, but a lot more is needed. I mean, significantly more is going to be needed in Japan in order to achieve neutrality by 2050. We're starting to see solar fishery projects in Taiwan, which is something that we're very interested in, where basically fishermen can fish and you can have your solar panels next to it. So you make the most of the land. And there's a lot more floating projects are being planned on water bodies in Korea, in Japan, in Singapore, where modules can prevent the evaporation of the water, and at the same time modules perform better because of the cooling effect of the water. So these new technologies are going to be critical for solar to expand in these countries with very restricted, with very high land constraints.
And just to go back, just to focus on usage of land, in those jurisdictions such as Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, how do you see the government role? And of course, in this podcast, we absolutely do not talk about politics because it's not our area of expertise, but just in terms of general government policies in the promotion of renewable energy, because obviously all three want to decarbonize, all three have targets, but are the policies kind of still need fine-tuning, or you think we're getting there?
Well, Taiwan has now a very attractive feed-in tariff. Taiwan is looking to phase out nuclear by 2025, and it has a target of 20 gigawatts of solar by then, which is very hard to achieve. But it has a very attractive feed-in tariff. The feed-in tariff has gone up this year, which is usually the opposite. Obviously, it's because of COVID and the higher prices of equipment. But the good thing about Taiwan that it also has a corporate PPA, so you can switch. You can start with the feed-in tariff and you can switch to the PPA. The issue with Taiwan is really the land availability. The land is very fragmented. You need to aggregate, and it takes a lot of time. So one thing that the government could do there, for example, would be to aggregate land for investors or for developers next to a point where there is a secure interconnection point with the grid capacity. So that could accelerate the deployment significantly. So that's one thing that the government could do. But the framework is solid. I mean, the government in Taiwan is very committed to renewables. When it comes to South Korea, There's also a very strong framework based on RPS and renewable energy certificates. The market is moving in the right direction. There is about 4 gigawatts of projects installed every year. There are some grid constraints, and that's something that if utilities could upgrade the grid faster, that will help with accelerating the deployment of capital as well. And the same thing with the aggregation of land. Land is probably not as fragmented as in Taiwan, but it's equally scarce. So if governments can, identify the land and the grid connection points, it could accelerate the process for deploying capital.
And I'm guessing in both Taiwan and South Korea, one of the challenges is that the central government or federal government, whatever you want to call it, has to kind of cooperate and collaborate with the very local government, whose job, I guess, would be to aggregate some of these kind of portions of land. And do you see that communication is better or worse in one jurisdiction versus the other?
In the case of Taiwan, there is the big issue has been the land conversion or agriculture, and that has been centralized from the Council of Agriculture, and that is really a big issue because restrict potentially land that has already is large and aggregated, and that you cannot use it. So then, industrial land is extremely expensive for solar. So that is something that has been the big issue, and that the government has not been willing to be as flexible as one would expect. And when it comes to Korea, the development is very, very local. So the rules are not the same whether you're in the east or the west, and it's extremely important who you know and where you come from and so forth. And those are issues for international investors, obviously, and that's why you need to have your local development team on the ground.
Right. And I guess the one missing out of the three is Japan. What about the kind of drive from the government in Tokyo with regards to kind of facilitating land use for renewable energy projects for investors?
Well, Japan had experienced a significant boom after the Fukushima accident, after the nuclear plant accident. And that was on the back of a very, very attractive feed-in tariff that at the time was 40 yen per kilowatt hour when it was launched. And that tariff has been coming down gradually. So that means that Japan is now has a significant amount of solar installed already, close to 80 gigawatts. So during the last few years, the government has not made it as easy as before to implement solar. It has gone through an auction process for large solar. There's no more feed-in tariff. The prices have come down very, very low. And it's very hard to make the projects profitable. Japan is a very expensive country. It's very expensive to build, and it's very hard to get good flat land for solar. So on the back of that, it has become harder and harder to do solar in Japan. The projects have become smaller and smaller, and to a point that utilities you see 5-6 gigawatts of projects installed every year, but utility scale projects are a very, very small percentage of that. What is now happening is that the government is installing a feed-in premium. It has installed this feed-in premium in April, and at the same time, the corporate PPA market is now is now taking off. Obviously, the corporate PPA market in Japan is huge, right? It's a very, very high industrial install capacity there. So we need to see what happens. That could mean that corporates are willing to pay more and prices for green electricity go up, and that might facilitate these kind of projects that I was talking before, like agri-solar, floating PV, fishery PV, on the back of higher demand from corporates and higher prices.
Got it. Great. So that's kind of the first major issue on your mind. What's another one?
Well, so land, obviously, the other one is the grid capacity that we're talking about, especially countries like Vietnam and Australia. There's a big grid issues there and makes the projects very, very risky, right? In particular, in Japan, depending on whether the node that you connect your project, is an importing node or an exporting node, you can have a penalty, or you can get paid. You can be rewarded. So that means that those projects, the revenues, there's a lot of volatility, and it becomes more risky projects. So the grid capacity, especially Vietnam, Australia, but also now growing in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, is something that, if accelerated, if the utilities upgraded faster, that's something that could accelerate the deployment of capital.
What about distributed generation, or just something too small, too localized, and it doesn't really affect things? Is distributed generation, distributed energy, a solution?
Well, it's part of the solution, right? Obviously, places with limited land, you need to do rooftop and smaller projects. Like I was saying, in Japan, the trend is for smaller and smaller projects, but it's a lot harder to scale, right? When you're talking about carbon neutrality, still quite 3 decades away, but you're going to need a combination of both distributed and utility scale. And yes, I mean, distributed energy is happening in these countries. Taiwan is a very big and dynamic rooftop project with a good feed-in tariff. South Korea, not as dynamic, but a growing market. It's not going to rooftop and distributed energy is not going to be enough, right? You're going to need utility scale.
Right. So basically, the second issue, you're calling for a lot more and more accelerated investments by the utilities in terms of the grid infrastructure. And I guess a related investment that they have to undertake is kind of the digitalization or digital energy solutions and technologies that need to be added to the system because of the entry of renewable energy as a big portion of the energy mix, right?
Yes, digitalization is going to be a big trend in Asia. Obviously, it's digitalization, but it's also making the grid more intelligent and being able to make the grid not just flowing in one direction, but in both directions, and making the grid more resilient. So this is something that there is a lot of work being done in different places in Asia. In Singapore, there's a big study about making the grid intelligent and a lot more flexible. In China, obviously, there's a lot going on. This is going to be a big part of the transformation in the next decades. More, I see it more as a medium to long term thing than in the short term. But certainly a big part of the investment that will be required.
Given the magnitude of investments that we're talking about in just these very few countries that we mentioned, but obviously it's happening in other countries as well. What about the issue of the human resources, the human capital? I mean, do we have the human capital in Asia? Is that perhaps a third major issue?
This is actually the next issue that I was going to mention, and there is definitely we are seeing definitely a lack of talent in the market. So there's a lot more demand than supply for professionals in the sector, and it takes some time to get professionals up to speed. So there is definitely a war for talent. It's very clear, and it's just talent, but knowing about the specific markets, having the right relationships, and so forth. So there's a combination of things, and that takes time. There is a lot more players coming into Asia, and that's making it harder. So something that at the more junior level that also universities and governments can work on is putting more emphasis on the energy transition and facilitating companies the hiring of future leaders.
And I think one of the things I think I mentioned in a couple of podcasts already, and also wrote in my book, is the fact that there seems to be a lack of understanding of how much kind of knowledge acquisition, knowledge capacity you actually need, and not just in terms of having engineers and the trained labor to build a solar farm, but also on the finance side of things. Because if you look, I don't know if you agree, but if you look at I think there's a huge demand in the private equity world, in the commercial banking world, for people who actually understand the complexities of renewable energy projects and the risks involved, et cetera, et cetera. Well, is that also your opinion?
Absolutely. So in general, what you see is people that have either the technical skills, the engineering skills, or the finance skills. And it's very difficult to find people that, can put the whole thing together, right? That can understand both the finance side of the business, but also from a technology point of view, what it takes to build a plant. What are the issues? What are the things that can go wrong? How to manage a project? So I think this is something that is going to be an issue. It is already an issue, and it's something that certainly universities and government it's something that they can get involved and provide some support for companies. Obviously, there's a lot of training that we go through in private companies, and these days there is a lot of things in the internet that you can access and so forth. But the fundamental education of the basics of the education, the fundamentals, that's something that people should know from university.
Well, the Asian Climate Capital podcast is a knowledge sharing platform, so I think it should be made mandatory for all corporations and all universities in Asia. Just joking. Great. So apart from the usage of land, the grid restrictions, the lack of human capital, what are some of the other kind of issues that are close to your heart?
Well, when it comes to offshore wind, except for China, Asia is also is behind Europe, right? So offshore wind, the most promising markets, in addition to China, are Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of having the required supply chain, the requirements for ports, transmission infrastructure, also not just for solar but also for offshore wind, and And, you need to consider the potential environmental and social constraints. So there's a number of things that need to happen for this market to take off. We're seeing a lot of activity, but we're seeing that these markets, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, with huge potential, we're talking about of markets for around 10 gigawatts by 2030. So it's not something that's going to happen in the very short term, right? It's going to take some time. And also the talent, of course, as we were saying, these are more complex projects. These are huge projects, and it requires a very specific expertise. The other thing that I would say is that Asia is also behind Europe when it comes to corporate PPAs. And this is something that could potentially accelerate the deployment of capital in Asia for what I was saying before, right? There's going to be an overwhelming demand of green electricity from corporates, and that could, supply and demand being out of whack could potentially increase the price of electricity, and that would provide more incentive for people to do projects that otherwise would not do. Luckily, this regulation is coming now. South Korea is implementing the corporate PPA market now. Japan has already started recently. Taiwan has one project with a corporate PPA already. Vietnam is going to start hopefully this year or early next year. Malaysia is also thinking about it. So there are many countries that are putting that framework now, and that's very positive.
I see. It's still kind of like young days for corporate PPAs in Asia. Actually, one of the podcasts was just talking about corporate PPAs and the development in Asia, and how important that is. And is perhaps another issue that is close to your heart or that you think about quite a bit, the whole kind of cost parameters, which I guess is also related to the corporate PPA in terms of the pricing, but are the cost parameters something that you think about quite a bit?
Yes, in some cases, yes. The market is very competitive, right? And margins are very thin. What happens is that when you tend to have a situation where you have a high tariff that is attractive, developers tend to price it at a level that is just enough for investors to get their required return. So it's very hard to make a higher return than that. So developers have already figured out what is exactly what investors can pay. So they tend to get all that margin for themselves. So it becomes a seller market because there's a lot more capital than good projects for the reasons that I mentioned, right? Because of the lack of talent, the lack of land, the lack of grid. That means that there's a lot more capital than good projects, especially recently with all the liquidity that has been injected. So that makes it a very, very competitive market. And when there is a situation where there is a good tariff, then the developers figure out how to price it in a way that they keep the vast majority of the profits.
And what about the cost of equipment? I mean, after the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I mean, we already had kind of prices going up, the cost of solar cells going up because of COVID and the supply chain disruptions. But I think that the Putin's war in Ukraine has made things worse.
Well, when we look at these countries in Asia, except for Australia and Indonesia that are exporters of coal, and Malaysia that exports oil and gas, the rest of the countries are net importers of energy. So this means that they will be paying higher prices for energy. And that's always good for renewable energy, right? If anything, the current situation should remind us that we're not transitioning fast enough to a renewable future, and that we should be doing a lot more and a lot faster, right? It also reminds us that renewables are not just necessary to fight climate change, but also for countries like Korea, Japan, and Taiwan that import more than 90% of their energy supply. Renewables can reduce their reliance on energy from the rest of the world. So that's very, very important. Now, I personally think that we're going to be in a very different environment than the environment before COVID. We have been for decades now in a disinflationary environment where the cost of capital had been trending downwards for 40 years. And for us in the solar business, we always looking for the next year. We were systematically forecasting a lower EPC price and a lower tariff, and never thought about inflation really. However, I believe that for different reasons, inflation will remain with us. That doesn't mean that renewables will not become competitive because the EPC prices might go up or might not go as down as previously. The learning curve has been, when you look at the learning curve for solar, it has been 22% since the 70s, since the very early days of the markets. But in an inflationary environment, what might happen is that EPC costs might not go as low as before, or might even stay the same price. But then the cost of conventional energy is going to be a lot more expensive. So what you need to look at is the relative cost of renewables versus conventional energy. And that's going to continue to improve, potentially even faster in an inflationary environment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key, and not enough people are talking about. And I haven't seen any numbers from any of the major consultants yet, but I'm sure they're working on them in terms of the average cost per megawatt hour of coal-fired generation or gas-fired generation in such places as around the region as a comparison. I mean, I do know about some of the prices in Australia, which have basically gone through the roof. I mean, we all know that oil prices have gone up, coal prices have gone up, and gas prices have gone up. And so even if solar goes up a bit, I think the gap, the delta between the two of them is still going to be quite massive, which, in my personal opinion, is very, very good news for renewables, because it's going to help the energy transition, the momentum of the energy transition.
That's right, and a good example could be what's happening now in Korea. So in Korea, S&P prices, the system marginal price, is now around 200. Korean won per kilowatt hour. It was less than half a year ago, right? So you will see utilities have been in Korea. You have utilities having tenders every 6 months where you can bid for a tariff for 20 years, a fixed tariff for 20 years. That tariff had been in the past trending down, but now it's going to be very difficult for utilities not to increase those prices, because when you look at merchant prices, they are significantly higher than the PPAs that were signed last year. Last year, the PPAs were signed at around 143 Korean won per kilowatt hour. So today you're talking about S&P prices of 200 plus. You need to add the REC to that, so you're talking about 250. So it's almost double. And there is no way that EPC prices have gone up 2 times, right? So you can see the importance of the relative cost difference between renewables and the conventional energies.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely key, and it's something that we should be speaking about more. Now, moving on to the part 3 of the discussion, and the last part, it's really about your thoughts, given your experience, as to the general business and finance of trends of the energy transition in Asia over the next 10, 20, 30 years, knowing that there will be very short-term gyrations, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But let's talk a little bit more where we're going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now. What are your thoughts, Fabian?
Well, look, in generally, very, very positive about Asia. If anything, the center of gravity of the global economy have been moving towards Asia. And if anything, what's happening now in the world, in my view, is going to accelerate that. China is going to, on a relative basis, China is going to become even more and more important and faster than before, based on what's happening. And, as China grows, Asia will become a lot more important. The demand for electricity here is going to continue to increase significantly. So this is not, when you look at the West, in many countries, the demand is pretty much flat. But when you look here at places like China, even South Korea, Taiwan, the demand is still increasing. Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the demand for electricity is increasing at 9%. So when you look at Asia, it's not just about replacing the old carbon plants or coal plants. Is more about it's about that, but it's also about all the new demand that has to be met. That is just huge. So it will require massive amount of investment, and as we said before, a significant amount of talent to be able to do that. So yeah, the future is very exciting for renewables in Asia. I think it is the region. It is the place to be. It has been slow at the beginning. Obviously, Europe at the beginning was the place where most of the things were happening. But I think we passed that tipping point, and now Asia is just becoming more and more important.
And regarding those kind of four elements that you mentioned, do you see kind of all four smoothing out over the next? There won't be issues anymore in 10 or 20 years, or do you think that some of these issues will linger? And I'm referring to usage of land, referring to the grid issue, the human capital limitation, the challenges of the offshore wind developments, and finally the advent of corporate PPAs, or the increase of corporate PPAs.
Well, those are all issues that are obviously that there are solvable, right? There are solutions for all of them. Offshore wind is just a question of time until we have the right infrastructure in place and the supply chain in place. The resource is there. There's plenty of resource in these countries. So that's it just need a few years to get work out, right? Land is obviously you cannot create land, but there's new technologies that you can implement in order to solve that problem. So, but in any case, offshore wind is going to be a big part of the energy transition for these countries because of the land scarcity, right? And when it comes to talent, of course, this is something that I think that countries like China have already been working in terms of solving that issue and have improved significantly, and that's something that is going to be worked out without a doubt. These are all things that can be worked out. It needs investments. It needs times. The good thing is that in Asia, in a large part of Asia, you have big savings and investments. Is a continent where the investments are the most, and that's why I'm so optimistic about it.
Right, and so I guess you agree with kind of at least my thought that you see right now a surge in the amount of capital which can go towards everything related to decarbonization, the energy transition, and that capital is not going to go away tomorrow morning. And if anything, it's probably going to increase. And if we look, for example, at commercial banks, a lot of commercial banks don't yet have net zero portfolio targets. At least in talk about Asian banks, not the international banks. So obviously, over the next few years, they will have, and so there will be more green lending available, and just one of the many examples. Well, would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely agree with that, and also where I see is the mandates for corporates are just huge. So I ask myself, where is that all supply going to come from? For example, in Korea, when you talk about the top, so Korea has a market of about 600 terawatt hours per year of electricity. It's the size of Germany, right? When you talk about the top 10 or 20 companies, I was being told very recently, and their suppliers is about 10% of the electricity of the country. So that is just massive. And those companies that are the biggest companies have very aggressive targets. Some of these companies can have targets of 40-50% of green electricity by 2030. So where is that all supply going to come from? That to me is gonna, lead to higher prices, and higher prices eventually is going to lead to more supply.
Right. Well, that's great. Look, I really appreciate the time. I really enjoyed the conversation. Sorry for interrupting many times, but it was really interesting. Are there any kind of final thoughts, insights or views that you'd like to share, Fabian?
No, we are as Glennmont. We're growing fast in Asia. We're focusing now a lot of our efforts in Korea and in Taiwan, but we're also looking at Japan and Australia. We started last year. We already have a team of 4 people full time in Asia, plus the support functions that Nuveen provides us. So it's a very exciting platform. We're very excited with the progress that we have done with the first close of the global fund, and we're now we're working with very high reputational partners, and we're very excited about what's happening.
Well, look, Fabian, once again, I really appreciate it. We're getting into kind of evening territory in Singapore, so I really appreciate the time, and yeah, so just wanted to thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Always a pleasure.
I trust you found the conversation useful. As always, feedback is really key, and in order to make the content useful and relevant to you and other listeners, please do give us some feedback. Also, please like the podcast in whatever podcast app you use, and send us your comments, your thoughts, your ideas for topics anytime at the Asia Climate Capital Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Asia Climate Capital Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you.